This meeting's title is Industry Consensus Standards for Accessibility Reporting. The main point of this meeting, the main point of this whole project, which is still in its inception stages, is that I really want to make your job easier, and I want to make things more profitable for you. Okay, the way that I want that to happen is that I really want procurement officials to be able to make faster, better informed choices concerning accessibility. Now, to do that, we need to make it easier for them to determine the results of accessibility tests, because they're using a standardized, simplified format. And this would make vendors take accessibility more serious, because the format clearly exposes any shortcomings. And this would result in more work for the accessibility field to support the increased needs of industry. Okay, so that would mean that you don't need to do as much to convince industry that there's a problem, which makes things easier for you, and that there'd be more work to go around, which would mean things would be more profitable for you. So that's really what I'm intending to do here. But by way of explanation as to how we got to this point of having this online meeting, this really started over a year ago, when I started having discussions with a few folks. And so we ended up having a preparatory meeting, the three meetings. This meeting today is number 3. But the first meeting we had was basically after the ICT Accessibility Testing Symposium last year. I gathered 12 people from 12 different organizations, accessibility testing organizations. And the list that I've got up here, it was one person from each organization, because we wanted a small exploratory discussion, very informal. So we had representatives from the Access Board, Accessibility Oz, Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, Level Access, Paciello Group, Renfro Consulting, Site Improve 10, and WebAIM, and W3C Web Accessibility Initiative. So this meeting was really just to sort of explore the idea of standardized reporting of accessibility test results, and to answer these questions: can we, should we, and how should we? And at the end of the first meeting, we came away saying, okay, something should happen, but we're not sure what, and we're not sure how, and we're not sure who. Okay. But we all agreed that there was a problem. So in the intervening time, in the first part of this year, I've had on and off discussions with a lot of people, and that resulted in the next meeting that we had, which happened in 3 weeks ago on June 20th in DC, and this was the day after the M-Enabling Summit. And in that meeting, we had about 25 people from accessibility consultancies, federal government, industry, and nonprofits. And we just laid out this idea, to have discussion among the field of, like, if we were to standardize accessibility reporting, would this work, and how would it work, and would people be interested to be involved? And the general consensus was yes, and we got a little bit further along, we've really decided that it's better to try to form the group and then to try to figure out what the work is, versus forming a proposal and saying to everybody, this is exactly how it will be, you need to join, and then you need to follow our lead, and all these sort of things. Instead, no, this is an industry, I'm setting this up as an industry started project, which is open, open to members coming in and helping to shape and define what it is that we want to do as an industry with accessibility reporting. Um, okay, and then so this meeting, we decided there was a lot of people that couldn't attend in person on the 20th, so we decided to hold this online meeting, and that's this one today. So in addition to the types of cohorts that we have represented in the previous meeting, we've also got state government and legal firms and higher education. So those groups are all represented here. Okay. So there are even some people who've said to me that they can't attend today, so we're recording this so that we can share this meeting with folks later on. Right now we've got a mailing people sort of specifically interested in this project. And so it's growing in terms of interest. I'm sure you're very keen to know what we're actually proposing, so we're going to get to that. This meeting would last, is planned to last for 2 hours. It's divided into 3 sections, an introductory section, and then goals for the standards, and then a plan and proposal section. And each of those are about 30 minutes long. And then within the remaining time, we'll have an open Q&A. Okay, we will take some questions during the sessions. The questions moderator is Laura Renfro from Renfro Consulting. Thanks very much to Laura for stepping in and helping. With the number of people that had joined, I figured it was just going to be impossible for me to keep track of all the questions that were coming in. If you do have questions, what we want you to do is to type your questions in the chat window, and then Laura will be the person that will convey the questions during the section, or we'll hold those questions till the end. Please, in the main sections, just refrain from using the raise your hand feature, although we may call on you to speak if we need clarification about a particular question. Okay. And then during the quick Q&A session at the end, we will use the raise your hand feature, and you will be able to type questions. And again, Laura will be moderating that. Okay.
Hey, Chris, there was there was a question about real-time captioning, and I just wanted you to address that now if you can.
Sure, there is no real-time captioning for this meeting because I haven't received any requests for real-time captioning. If I had received that in the beginning, I would have had it. But we are recording it so that, and when it's posted for recording, it will be captioned. Okay. I saw another thing that said that the invite was for a half an hour. Can you please let me know when the recording is available? Yes, if you're on the mailing list, you will know. And the invite that you got from me was for 2 hours, so it wouldn't have been for a half an hour. Sorry, you got that from somebody else as a forwarded invite. Okay. All right. Any other questions to deal with, Laura, before we move on?
I think you addressed it. Tiffany was asking if the slides will be available, and I think that they will as part of the recording.
Yes,
correct? And then that was the only one. Okay.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So let's jump in with the introduction. I want to ask you if you've actually heard this news that consumer product review sites are including accessibility in their testing. Okay, so I've got a slide up here showing a page snippet from Consumer Reports, actually, and it's Consumer Reports and their ratings of smartphones. So they have Samsung, Apple, these are the top ones. So it's jumping between Samsung and Apple, 5 or 6 products, and they have their ratings out of 100. So a phone might get 90, and that rating breaks down across a number of different factors that they test for. So things like reliability, owner satisfaction, battery life, display performance, and there's a new category called accessibility. And so the scale for accessibility, poor, fair, good, very good, or excellent. So it's a 5-point scale. And we've got a few that are good and some that are, very good on there. And as we all know, the iPhone and Android phones have good built-in accessibility. So why wouldn't they receive fairly good ratings from this new system? Okay. And so now, they're using this same rating system on things like washing machines. Anything that is an electronic device, they're able to rate these things for the traditional things that they rate for, like washing performance, energy efficiency, that sort of thing. They explain. You can get an explanation of how they measure water efficiency. So there's a pop-up that explains that. And you see here they've added accessibility now, and so this score denotes whether the product is operable by people with disabilities, with low or no vision, low or no hearing, limited physical manipulation capabilities, etc. Yeah. So this is a new thing, right? No, this is most definitely not a new thing. So before you all Google what's happening with Consumer Reports right now, I'll save you the task. No, this doesn't exist. Actually, this the ratings of iPhones and Apple iPhones and Android phones for accessibility doesn't exist on a site like Consumer Reports, even though Consumer Reports is one of the most important places for consumers to go find out about products. Accessibility is not something that they deal with. It's not something that they regularly report on. So washing machines, if you're trying to find a washing machine that works for you, if you have an accessibility concern, that's not the place to go for it. Now, I don't want to just pick on Consumer Reports here. I could have chosen CNET. I could have chosen Which in the UK, Which with a question mark. That's the equivalent of Consumer Reports in the UK. Wirecutter, doesn't matter. There's lots of review companies out there, and yeah, somebody I just saw in the chat said, "Way to dash my hopes." Actually, there was in the in-person meeting. It was a much longer presentation, some elements of which I'll get into next, to really talk about this, and people at the end, they said they were devastated by the fact that this wasn't the case. Okay, so yeah, no, it doesn't have Consumer Reports and others do not report on accessibility right now of mainstream consumer products.
Hey Chris, some people
Sure.
are waiting to join the meeting. Could you please let them in?
Sure. Okay.
And
Thanks.
also, Lainey Feingold was about to put it on Twitter that Consumer Reports had this accessibility feature. So
well,
had us going, Chris.
It would be great, wouldn't it? That's yeah. I'm glad if you didn't post that. Thanks. But you'd have to then post a retraction. This is the sort of thing, if it did actually happen, then this could be front page news if they were doing this, but they don't. Okay, so the previous slide that I was saying here, this whole project, this whole idea started with a what if, and the what if was really, I was thinking when I was buying a car about this sticker. It's called the Monroney sticker, if you don't know. It's the sticker that's on the window of every new car that is sold in this country, and Canada, I believe, has an equivalent. But it's been mandated since about 1958. And what was happening before was, people were buying a car, and the salesman would say, "Yeah, it's got a stereo 8-track player, and it's got alloy wheels, and it's got the Go Faster stripes on the side." And then it came to do the transaction, and the car would arrive and say, no, I didn't tell you that there was a stereo 8-track player and stripes and stuff like this. So this law came into effect to say, look, you have to say what is in the car. What are the standard features? And then that gets tied to a VIN number, the vehicle identification number. so that the consumer can see it before they buy that product, and the VIN number won't change. So since the mid-70s, they've added fuel economy, since the oil crash that happened in the early 70s. So there was EPA standards since the mid-1970s. And there's been crash test ratings. It's mandatory since 2007, but people have been putting on details about crash test things onto this sticker since way before then. So the crash test is one figure. You know, it's a 5-star safety rating. So all you get to see about crash testing is one measure, 5 stars, and that's it. Okay. Now, in the accessibility field, we think about there's loads of different disabilities, and there's loads of different methodologies for testing, loads of different methodologies for reporting. But can you imagine if you were a consumer and you were trying to figure out, is this useful? And then you think about some of the things that the accessibility field is putting out, VPATs and things that we'll get into later, where this is the explanation of how accessible something is. There is no equivalent. And that's really a problem. So, you know, if you were thinking about going back to consumer reports and, you know, the problem of consumer demand is that there's no law about consumer products and accessibility, right? The laws are about things like transportation and education. You could argue that the CVAA that came in a few years ago relates to consumer products. So there's some incursion into that. But across the board, and things like washing machines, you know, if a washing machine is not connected to the internet, then it wouldn't fall under the CVAA, right? So, so what incentive do manufacturers have to make their products accessible? One of the things that they don't like when their products get reviewed by Consumer Reports, one of the things that they really don't like is red marks, yeah, the red dots. And so what would be the situation if we had red dots appearing for all manner of consumer products? Because the Consumer Reports and other organizations started reviewing accessibility. Even if the answer was no, in the beginning, you know, you'd be looking at microwaves, you'd be looking at washing machines, and they'd all have red dots. And I'm sure that the manufacturers would scream blue murder, but it's a fact. This would allow consumers to view accessibility as much as the same way as they do other aspects of companies, you know, whether they use fair trade practices, for example. You know, people want to know whether their T-shirts are being made by companies that are using sweatshops and child labor, right? And companies are going to great lengths to explain that they don't do those things. And it's changed practices. But we don't have the same equivalent of that for accessibility. And, you know, the main drivers of change here would probably not be people with disabilities. It would be the regular public who are looking at this as a whole and saying, why is that red mark there? And then following that down into, you know, to try to find out what is it that this company is doing. Most people that you talk to don't think about accessibility. If you work in the accessibility field, you know this. And if you start talking to people about, well, you could make something accessible, they kind of get it, and then they kind of get why it doesn't happen. They say, you know, there's lots of excuses. And if, like me, you've been working in the universal design field for a very long time, 25 plus years, you will know that arguing that you should make something universally designed doesn't result in universal design. Having this sort of figure and a red dot next to products could make things universally designed. This I think could lead to that. Because you might want a manufacturer, you might have a manufacturer that says, yeah, actually I would like a very good or excellent rating on accessibility. instead of those red ratings. So I would put in voice output so that people could use it without vision. I would have it work via an accessible smartphone app. Okay. There's somebody with the noise in the background, so if you can just mute your phones, please, or mute your computer, because we've got some background noise coming in. Sorry. Getting back to the presentation. So use without hearing. You could have the full interface flashing on a finished cycle and that sort of thing. You can have it provide a vibration alert for smartphone users. You could, for low vision, you could request print label overlays, large print or braille overlays, and the company would send those free on request. You could have a high volume output in the initial setup of your product, to quadruple the volume or something like that, so that people with low hearing would be able to hear it. Okay, for reduced physical manipulation, easy to push doors, controls within reach. You can load a full bottle of Tide into the washer and leave it for a month, and you don't have to do that task. For some people with physical disabilities, that would be great. That product has just been, they're selling it now, the one where you can load a full bottle of Tide. But again, small increments. These other things are just not actually happening. Okay, and then other factors to do with accessibility. It's not just the product, but it's the customer support line, the manufacturer's website. Is that accessible? The smartphone app, is that accessible? Is the user manual accessible? And right now, us in the accessibility field, we know that the answer is no. Generally, the answer is no. This is a product that I just bought. I just bought a new home cinema. We just moved house, and it's tied in with an app. And what if that app could control all the elements of my home theater interface in an accessible way? What if the companies said that that's the sort of thing we do? We make this stuff accessible. What if in their advertising we started seeing things like all users, where they're saying, look, we're trying to take this stuff seriously, and that you would end up with these sorts of good ratings coming. At the moment, you don't get that, unfortunately. In real life, as it is now, instead, what you get is things like washing machines that are not directly accessible at all in the manner that I just talked about. There have been some prototypes that have been developed in the past where people have come up with talking elements of washing machines, right? So this is an example here from, it's from 2016, okay? I'm going to try to bring up the video. Let's see if this will work. I have to change. Okay, let's see if this will work. I don't think the audio is coming through, but what's happening on the video is that the video is, as somebody's turning the dial, it's saying whites, normal, towel sheets, delicates, that sort of thing. So this was a prototype that was demonstrated back in 2016. And one of the comments on the YouTube video was, I'm totally blind and I love something like this. It'd be very helpful if this comes to fruition. And indeed, it did come to fruition. This is an article from 2017 from CNET, and it says, "Listen up, this GE washing machine can talk. The $100 talking laundry module plugs into existing washers and dryers and audibly announces settings for vision impaired owners." Now, a lot of you who work in the accessibility field will be looking at this and thinking, that's a bit of an odd solution. Why have I got this module? The module looks like a a toaster. You know, it's a big, bulky module, and you actually plug it into the service port on the back of your washing machine. So you've got to pay $100 to make the washing machine that you've just bought accessible. Okay, so this is actually a screenshot from recently. This same company that produced this prototype, IB, or 1B, I think it is, sorry, first build, they sell this now. They sell this product. It's now $200 instead of $100. So now you've got to spend $200 to make your washing machine accessible. But it says on its website, it says these are the GE washers that it's compatible with, and there's 3 listed. One of those, I can tell you, is discontinued, so it's really compatible with 2. But GE actually sells 27 different brands of washing machine in the United States. And so these particular ones are like mid-range prices. Prices of their washing machines range from like $600 to $1,700. And this is in the mid-range. So if you're a disabled consumer with not much money, you might want to go with a lower end. Well, you can't, because then you don't have this. And then what are they thinking? That everybody is going to put one of these modules on every single product that they have? Yeah, they're going to put one on their microwave. They're going to put one on their fridge freezer. They're going to put one on their oven. It's just an absurd situation. And this review back in 2017 from CNET said, it says, "Are you ready to have a conversation with your washing machine? As ridiculous as that sounds, ... And they thought that was a good way to write this up. But no, as ridiculous as it sounds to somebody in the accessibility community, this is a ridiculous solution and should not be happening. But it is happening right now. Okay. If you go to, again, I don't want to just pick on Consumer Reports, but here's an example. If you type in accessibility into Consumer Reports, these are the sorts of results you'll get. A luxury car buying guide has nothing to do with accessibility. Best prepaid card buying guides. Okay, news articles about New York Auto Show. Father's Day gifts for older dads. Okay, that one may be. Best home treadmills, that sort of thing. And these are not really about accessible products. They just happen to have the word accessibility somewhere in there. But it's not an accessibility review. Those types of things are not happening. If you want to find out right now about the accessibility of a washing machine, this is a page from a manufacturer, and they typically have a section that says ADA compliant. And that section says ADA height, side and front reach compliant. Again, where's the other disabilities? Where are the other disabilities? If you look down the long list of products that this could be applicable to, in Consumer Reports, they listed alphabetically. They would have, so under B, you've got things like baby bathtubs. Should you measure that for accessibility? Yeah, maybe. Baby food, baby formulas, baby monitors. Okay, those are electronic. Yeah, we could circle that. That would be nice to have an accessibility rating to it. Backpack carriers, bacon, no. Banks and credit unions. Yeah, that would be good to have a rating. Okay, blenders. Well, they have visual interfaces too. Blood glucose meters, blood pressure monitors, Blu-ray players. Yes, Blu-ray players. How about that? We don't have that. Instead, what we have is we have these rather complicated interfaces now for products that you really couldn't hope to use if you had if you were low vision, you know. And this idea of putting a toaster size box on the back of a machine to make it work is straight out of the 1980s in terms of accessibility. I don't know if you noticed the fact that I don't know if you noticed the fact that this interface here in the bottom, this is in Russian. So, you know, the things that we talk about is in universal design. Well, sure, if you went to Russia and you were trying to wash your clothes, and you could if you had a talking interface and you could change that interface to English, then maybe you could use it while you're traveling, right? These are all great ideas that the universal design community has put out. And other things that the universal design community have been pushing for the longest time is that design should be for everyone. And if you're so this is the bell curve, and I've used running as an example, but it applies to every human capability: seeing, hearing, physically manipulating, lifting, carrying, all those things. So in terms of running, at the far right of the spectrum, you've got the Olympic runners. Then you've got the people who are better than average, the people who go for a jog, maybe 2-3 times a week, in fairly good shape. And there's people like me who are maybe on the treadmill, a few extra pounds that they're trying to lose, and a bit below average in terms of running. And then at the far left of the spectrum, I've got a picture here of somebody with a walker. That person is never going to run for the bus, no matter how much you want them to. Okay, they're just not physically able. And so you've got to explain to people that this is consumers. If you're saying consumer reports, how about it applies to everything and every type of consumer that there is? We just don't have this. One of the arguments against this is that people with disabilities, they're not our consumers, they're not our demographic. We've heard this sort of thing many times before. And if you think about running, well, no, there are people with disabilities who are at the far right of the spectrum there, who are elite runners, who compete in the Olympics, even though they're blind. Okay, so no, you can't box us in. We've been making these arguments. You can't box us in. Okay, so we are thinking in terms of standards of reporting on accessibility of products. And when we say standards, some people will immediately sort of squirm away from the idea of standards. This sounds like more control. This sounds like more oversight. This sort of thing. Well, standards are everywhere in our life. Okay, not just in buying cars. Here I've got an image of a supermarket shelf, and boxes of cereals of all major types. Now, we know that there's a standardized label on the side that tells you how many calories are in these, right? We know that there's a methodology to figure out that calorie count, as there is for fat content and carbohydrates and sodium and those types of things. And it's a standard requirement that those things are put on there. And the FDA created that. Well, the FDA also created, inadvertently, they created supermarkets. Prior to refrigeration, buying food wherever you were in America was a bit of hit and miss, as it were. Lots of people died from products that were manufactured badly and without hygiene standards. And it was only in the early part of the 1900s, very early part, where refrigeration was just beginning to be thought of, and hygiene and understanding of what causes diseases, foodborne diseases, was just emerging. And they created standards. And when they created these standards, people could then start to trust that the food that they were buying would not kill them. And this whole industry emerged. Okay, so I've got another inset image here of all the different baking ingredients of a cookie, right? And you don't need to even bother to think about, is this stuff safe for me to use, right? And not everyone's going to make exactly the same cookie. You've still got freedom of choice on what you do with those ingredients. But there's a certain things that people just want to know the answer to. Okay. So some of us have started thinking about this in terms of, what could you have in terms of an accessibility report that had, instead of, a 30-page VPAT where things are hidden, instead that the results were just placed out in front for the world to see. These are the compliance items from WCAG 2.0. So this is now taking the same idea of consumer products and then applying this to the web as well. So on this page here, I've got this one-page kind of cover sheet for a report, and it all boils down to I've just put in a gold star here. We don't know what the rating is yet. We as a group have not figured out what that rating is. Okay, but the important thing is that to the viewer, they may see a gold star and say, okay, gold star for accessibility, yeah, I will go with that. So you can think of like, well, if you're looking at mobile apps in the App Store, you're not going to view a long page like this, but you might view just a gold star. Okay, so the question is, well, how do you get to this gold star? What are the criteria behind it, and what is involved in coming to this point? And for the people that really need to share and deeply know what the various aspects of a product are for accessibility, they can then go and find this kind of report. Yeah, so again, think of somebody buying a car and they look at it's either a 4-star or a 5-star crash rating. They don't ask necessarily, is there a 30-page report on this that I can browse and read up to figure out whether it did, because they just trust that somebody else did that for them. They just trust that somebody else has gone through the process in order to come up with that rating. Okay. So the real question that we have now is how we go from how do we get groups like Consumer Reports to build in to their process for consumer products something like accessibility, a test process that everybody agrees on that they could use to come up with that rating, even if it starts off being just sort of red marks. And how can we then apply that as well into web reporting as well, to have a single figure, but behind that figure there's a lot of trustable data that gets you there. Okay. We will talk about the hows of this in the next sections. I want to just pause here for a second and see if we've got some questions from folks.
2 questions that were here before is Tiffany would like just the slides, not the whole recording. Will you make just the slides available?
Possibly.
Okay, Tiffany, talk to Chris.
Yeah. That's a decision I'll have to make because there's a few things here where it's copyrighted material and stuff like that. So.
Okay, and then Lainey wondered if this meeting is confidential.
No, this meeting is not confidential. It's open. Anybody was invited to it, and there will be a recording that's made, and that will get posted. So no.
Okay, and then Sherry has a question about, will there be any attempt to reconcile your gold star, whatever the group decides, is the rating system, with AG, the silver, like the WCAG 3.0 is coming up with maybe a rating system also that's called AG?
AG or ACT. Yeah, we're going to talk about ACT in a few seconds here.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Sherry, just reply more if that wasn't the. Oh yeah, she got it. It's good. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you.
are. Yeah, we are. Yeah. So the folks from W3C, Shadi in particular, we've had discussions, and so they are. We'll get that. We'll get into that in a second. Yeah, but we have had those discussions. Yeah. Okay. So goals for the standards. Okay. Going back to the crash testing metaphor. Okay. People want to know, will my car survive a crash against a wall? And you've got to know that somebody has your back. Some people that have thought this through and figured out an entire process have come to the conclusion that yes, under certain circumstances, certain controlled circumstances, which include speed and other environmental factors, that your car will crash. If it crashes into a wall of a specific exact density, then the occupants should survive that crash. Okay, and that's a whole big process, a whole methodology that most consumers will never even want to get into to figure out what it is. But they kind of have to know that the car wasn't crashed into a wall of cardboard boxes, right? Because if you ask somebody, hey, if I crash this car into a wall, will it survive? And they say yes, but in their mind they are thinking cardboard boxes. Sure, yeah. There's stories of fake car manufacturers out in China that make something that looks like a Mercedes, but if you crash it into a wall, it's gonna turn into a pancake. Okay. So for us as consumers, we need to have that level of trust, and we need to know. Now, if we think about the accessibility field, and we say, okay, are we metaphorically crashing our car into the wall or into the cardboard box? And if you think about the VPAT right now, you don't really know. The manufacturer may say, yeah, we're crashing it into a brick wall, when they're actually crashing it into a cardboard box, because there's nobody looking at their test process. There's nobody validating their test process, let alone having a standard reporting format. And really, some of us have joked in the accessibility field that really what manufacturers do with VPAS is really just say, here's the product, go ahead and crash it yourself, and then decide whether you want to buy it or not. Okay, so buy it, crash it. I have personally worked in government agencies where this is the exact metaphor. We had to do all the testing for the vendors because the vendors weren't doing the testing themselves. They weren't validating things themselves. Why not? Okay. So can you trust that process? So I put a Volkswagen dealership up here because Volkswagen betrayed everybody's trust on their emissions ratings. They put in cheat software. It costs the company billions. Okay, but we just don't have anything like that. We don't have anything where you're assured that something will work for people with disabilities. Okay, this is what we want to change. Okay, so during the meeting that took place 3 weeks ago, I did a side-by-side comparison using a couple of volunteers. One person I gave a 3-page report to of accessibility, and the other I gave a VPAT to. And it was for the same product, the same problems, and I just asked them to put up their hand when they'd found the answer. After 10 minutes, the person with the VPAT hadn't found the answer. Within 1 minute the person reading the short report had. Okay. Now this short report is just something that I made up as a sort of, mock-up. And again, don't get, we haven't decided what the format is. We're just trying to use this as a representation to say, look, some sort of format, one-page format with a very short report could be very useful if we all agree on what it is. So this is not an agreed upon format. This is just a mock-up for explanation. So here we have this report with our gold star rating. At the top of the report, it says that it's passed 29 out of 30 applicable items, therefore that's 97%. So the items that were not applicable to this particular product, where there were 8 out of 38 possible WCAG AA things, so that's not included in the score because it's not applicable. And it only failed one. And the one that's failed is marked in red. It'd be very easy to zero in on. And there's a column for the result, a column for the target, and the target says 9/19. And then the next column says report page number. Okay, so if you go to the report itself, it's just a 2-page report. And it says WCAG 2.0, WCAG 2 AA conformance report is for a Microsoft product. Sorry to pick on Microsoft, just using this as an example. And it's for network performance monitor, who it was tested by, for more information and those types of links. The typical sorts of things that you might see on a VPAT today. Okay. And the results, it says cover sheet, standard report attached, passed 29 out of 30 applicable, fail 1 out of 30, see explanations beginning page 2, and not applicable 8 out of 38. So if you go to page 2, it says, here's the requirement. When any component receives focus, it does not initiate a change of context. Here's the failure on the topology dashboard page under system state selection. When a user selects the date inside the time menu using the keyboard, then post-selection, the keyboard focus does not return to the date selection box. Due to this, the user is not able to apply the selection as done. Okay. All right, so that's the thing. And then it says the remediation target date is September 2019 with a link that says notify me when this fix is made. Okay, can you imagine how easier somebody's life would be reading something like this than the standard VPAT right now? Yeah, the first page of a typical VPAT that I'm showing now doesn't say whether the product is accessible or not. Okay, it's just a few links to the accessibility website, who to do assistance, but there's no summary that says whether this is accessible or not. The actual answer is buried somewhere within the 27 pages of the report, and you need to have certain skills to go and be able to read this and try to find it. And it's usually written in accessibility speak, which is not procurement person speak. So that demonstration, that side-by-side demonstration we used was really just to show people, like, it doesn't have to be this way. We had a lot of discussions about VPATs in the last meeting. There was a lot of pros and a lot of cons. There have been some updates to the VPATs, but fundamentally, the VPAT is not the equivalent of the 5-star crash rating, right? If you were wandering around the car showroom and you said to the salesman, what kind of crash test rating does this car have? And he hands you a 30-page report and says the answers are somewhere in there. Go figure it out yourself. Okay, that's the equivalent. That's the equivalent of what we have now. And it's just not good enough. Even when they make summary reports, the summary reports are still just as confusing sometimes. Okay. So standards are actually a good thing. Talking of toasters, yeah, not the toaster-sized box that you stick on the back of your washing machine to make it talk for $200. No, you want a slice of toast, right? You want a slice of toast, and you've got lots of toasters to choose from out there. Now, one of the things that you don't want to have to worry about as a consumer is whether putting in a piece of toast will cause your house to burn down. And the reason that you don't have to worry is because you know that those toasters have all been tested to fit in standard sockets, and those standard sockets are tied to standardized electricity systems in people's homes. And that when you plug it in, the load going through that wire will not cause a fire, okay? So that's what the standard gives you. So standards are a good thing. And again, standards are absolutely everywhere, okay? In the fuel economy and in the part of the Monroney sticker, I've zoomed in on a particular area of this. It says 37 miles per gallon. That's a thing that's another number that people are, that's what they want to know. Bottom line, what's the miles per gallon? And yeah, you can't do a test. You can't put your car on a rolling road inside with no wind, in an enclosed building and say, well, we got 100 miles to the gallon because there's no actual friction, right? No, the test has to be done under certain controlled conditions. People want to figure out what it is now. And, standards also evolve over time, right? This is for a plug-in hybrid vehicle. 10 years ago, this sticker didn't need to exist, right? So the idea that you would you would create a standard and it's stuck for all time, that's not what standards are. Standards are continuously evolving. So this is why this project that we're talking about, this idea, is an initiative, a new initiative for the field to start of something that keeps evolving as technology evolves. This is not a one-off shot that we're doing. There is no association currently that will do this, and we'll talk a little bit more about that again soon. But the whole idea of creating this so that people have this type of representation, so that people have figures and they have trust and they have knowledge whether something is either fuel efficient or accessible, these are the sorts of things we need. It makes the buying process for the purchasing agent a lot easier. You, as the car buyer purchasing agent, you can go to any car dealer and you will see the same standardized information, okay? It makes the purchasing process easier on both sides, okay? Someone mentioned the ACT before, okay? There's a picture that if you Google the standing on the shoulders of giants, this is one of the ones that comes up first. But yes, there's been a hell of a lot of work that has happened in the accessibility field up to this point on requirements for accessibility, and more recently, testing for accessibility. And one of those things that has come up now is something called the accessibility conformance testing rules from the W3C. So anyway, so this was really just to say, look, there's a lot that's happened before, but for us, it's not enough. We still need to stand on the shoulders of giants. There's a lot of information that's already come our way, but there is more to do, okay? So the accessibility conformance testing rules from W3C way. I'm going to bring these up now. So 3 years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago now, Shadi Abuzara from W3C gave a presentation at the first annual ICT Accessibility Testing Symposium. And he was saying, we really need to have a way to describe test results and a way to codify and be able to replicate test results so that we can tell whether, so that manufacturers can tell, have they passed the WCAG requirements? And I asked him the question, I said, how long would this take? And he said, well, it's going to take about 3 years, we think. And I was a little bit shocked. I was like, 3 years? Surely this is really important. You should have this in a year. He said, well, no, we got to go through this process. And, you know, we got to go through each test case one by one. And we've got to then have lots of people involved, lots of meetings, lots of voting and that sort of thing. It's okay, all right, well, he came back the following year, gave an update, came back the following year, gave an update. This year at the testing symposium, they've submitted a presentation to say, here they are, here are the ACT rules, the accessibility conformance testing rules. And yeah, so sure enough, congratulations, it did take about 3 years. But now they have this wonderful set of data now for web, which is saying this is what the this is what the requirements are for various tests. So there's a set of rules, one for each item that you can test. Here's one I just took as an example. The document title is descriptive, and it tells you what the rule checks. This rule checks that the document title describes the topic or purpose of the document. And it tells you what it's applicable to. It tells you what the expectation is. The target element describes the topic or purpose of the overall content of the document. And goes into some more technical details. But it also gives you these test cases, and it says, look, this is one that will pass, okay? If you have your formatting of your data, your code for your website in this format, you are likely to pass, or you will pass, right? Here's another example. It gives you other examples of code. Then it also gives you examples of failures. There's a couple of different examples of failures of incorrect code. Okay, now that's just one example. There is this information is there for every single thing that's in WCAG. Now, if you are a manufacturer, you can of a test process, you can validate. You can use these test cases to validate whether your product actually finds these things. So, you know, one of the reasons this started, I think, is because automated test tools, people were getting confused as to whether automated test tools were testing everything that was applicable for WCAG. And lo and behold, we know that they don't. They typically test, you know, 25 to 30% of the things that are actually required. And so you could use this tool as a manufacturer to validate which things you could use your automated test tool to find. And then if the automated test tool can't find it, what manual methods can you use to validate as well? And so the ACT rules community, I will bring up their mission statement here of what they're doing, because although this is related and this is something we can build on, these are the shoulders of giants that we can use, because this resource now exists, that we can use it. But their mission statement is not to create a standardized reporting format. That's what the sort of thing that we're talking about. Their mission statement, it says, the ACT Rules Community Group is an open forum set up to document and harmonize the interpretation of W3C accessibility standards such as WCAG and WAY ARIA for testing purposes. The Rules Community Group achieves this by bringing together people developing, implementing, and using various accessibility testing tools and methodologies to document interpretations as test rules. Test rules are defined using the ACT rules format and reviewed by the community. The process of researching, documenting, and sharing knowledge from different perspectives within the group builds towards a common understanding. By publishing such test rules, ACTR hopes to motivate organizations to share their own insights and adopt commonly agreed test results. Okay, the group is not set up to remove differences or impose changes on accessibility testing tools and methodologies. There is value in innovation in diverse approaches. Rather, it aims to contribute to a more consistent test results, regardless of how the testing is done. Knowing whether something meets a requirement and when it does not should be clear and consistent. So this last paragraph of their mission statement of what they are not doing is really what we're trying to do. We are trying to say, okay, we need to set some standards as an industry consensus and say, what is good enough, right? What if you're purporting to say, I have a test that is valid, and somebody comes along and says, okay, right, we're gonna check to make sure that your test is valid. And then test it against some of these ACT rules and other test cases, then you can say, okay, we purport to say that our test process is valid and validated by this industry standards group. Again, that industry standards group doesn't exist. That's what we're talking about creating. But that would be a great use of this resource that has come before. You know, the ACT group has 146 participants, and those experts have come together to create this as a resource. And then there's other resources, other standards beyond WCAG as well, European standards and things like this. CVAA, there's lots of things that are feeding into this that you can use to take requirements and turn those requirements into actual test requirements, and then test against those test requirements, if that makes sense. Okay. Okay. I mentioned that long-held standards get updated. This was a news article that appeared earlier this year. So the image here is of this silvery disc that's encased in two layers of glass bell jars. And as if it's very, very precious. Okay, and this is the standard measurement that sits in a vault, I think somewhere in Europe, that is the kilogram. This is what a kilogram is, everybody, you know, and it's put into this double glass bell jar so that atoms of this piece of metal do not get knocked off by just a breeze going past. Okay, so they're very serious about it. But you know, this was the news article that came out. They're going to revamp what counts as a kilogram, and they're going to change the definition, and they might also change the definition of time. So things do evolve. Okay, but this is also a nice metaphor for us to have in terms of what this represents. So if you can think of this as, say, the WCAG requirements are represented by the weight here, okay, the metal object. That's the thing that's static, well, actually evolving in terms of WCAG, because it's now 2.1 and they're talking about 3.0. So the WCAG requirements are the thing that needs to be measured against, okay? Now, the way everybody measures right now, ACT gives us some really good test cases and some good solid groundwork for this, but there's lots and lots of different test tools. And you know, thinking about am I crashing my car into a cardboard box or a concrete wall? Am I testing an image alt tag properly, or am I testing it kind of fake? So if that the as we all know, in terms of looking at alt tags have to be descriptive in context. Well, it's really hard for a artificial intelligence or a automated tool to do just yet. And that may change in the future. But in terms of the validation of it, that methodology, that thing that says that everybody agrees upon as, hey, this is what constitutes a kilogram, we don't have that equivalent right now. Okay, so this is our need, is actually to have this sort of equivalent of this type of thing in the consumer products field and in websites and digital content, to have something that's maybe not quite at this level where they are defining things at the atomic level, but we are defining standards for how things are tested against and reported against. Okay. So in summary, the goals for this project, the goals for this initiative, I had this chart up earlier, this slide up earlier, where it was showing how the ratings from Consumer Reports goes from one where accessibility is not included to one where accessibility is included. And then how do we then take that and then apply that as well, that same type of thinking, to a single figure around accessibility of websites? So on the consumer product side, our goals would be to create an agreed upon test methodology, because right now there isn't an agreed upon test methodology for consumer products. If you were looking for a methodology that people at consumer products could use to go through the functional requirements, yes, you could make that test, but it's not in existence right now. We don't have all the disability community organizations supporting and rallying behind a particular agreed upon test methodology that would result in a standardized method of reporting that any group that was doing testing of consumer products could use. So that's one of our goals, is to create a test methodology that can be then used as standardized reporting, and hopefully have that those red dots start to appear on websites such as Consumer Reports, a CNET, or Wirecutter, that type of thing. For websites, we do have lots of test methods already, hundreds of them. That's why I have a lot of people on the call today. There are lots of different methodologies for testing a website to see if it's accessible. Okay, but there is no standardized method for reporting. So what we want to do is take those methods and determine how we could come up with a standardized method like the one-pager. And again, it doesn't have to be that particular one-pager. There's all manner of ways that could be represented, but we need something that is a succinct one-pager that then you can come up with one measure. People have said, well, it shouldn't just be WCAG, it could be usability of the product as well. It could be a rating that relates not just to consumers, but to purchasers. Those types of things, as to how do you define what your consumer is. So we need to agree upon what that is, and we need to come up with a standardized method for reporting. And the ACT folks, remember, they are just looking at these are many ways that you can go and test your product, your test tools, to see whether they find these types of failures, but they do not prescribe and say, this is a way to then report that out. That's what's missing. And in my discussions with them, they said, well, we can't really do that. We can't prescribe one particular way of reporting. And indeed, if you look back to the evolution of most standards, you would have competing standards bodies. You'd have European standards doing one thing, Canadian standards would do another, American ANSI standards would be working on another. And so it's up to, where there is a vacuum, it's up to us to just say, okay, well, let's go in and fill this vacuum and create our standardized reporting methodology. Okay. We would also need an agreed upon method for validating test results. We don't have that right now, but you would need to have, if you were a member of a group and you said, well, we have a validated test method that we know reliably generates these standardized reports. Well, you're going to need behind that, you're going to need something that generates validated reports by having a validation process where you can actually do that and say, look, we're part of this group and we have a validated process. That's kind of the goal for both of those. Okay. So that's the end of that section. And again, I'm going to open this up and pause a second here for questions.
Hey, I haven't seen any new ones come through. So folks, if you guys have them, send them out for Chris.
Yeah, this is all new stuff for many, but pause just one second. I've got a list of a lot of questions that were posed at the end of the last meeting or throughout the last meeting. Is this generally? I'll just do a general question. Is this generally resonating with folks? Up to now, when I've been discussing this with people, people do generally support it. So, okay. There's one question that came in. Oh, there's a few questions coming in.
Yeah, one is, when you're talking about testers, can you define who you mean by testers? They're asking, do you mean QA testers, developers, UAT testers?
Yeah,
what are you referring to?
I think it could be anybody. I think one of the problems that we've had in the past is that you had to be a high level trained tester in order to do an accessibility test. Certainly 10 years ago, that was the case where people were only testing with things like JAWS and other assistive technologies. And these days, there's a lot of push to have anybody be a tester, and especially QA. I mean, I've talked about this in many presentations, and especially people who are doing QA testing right now of products, and you want to have a methodology that they can use. So this should be anybody doing testing. So if you get a tool and you become trained in the use of that tool, you should be able to generate a standardized report. So it could be anybody. Yeah.
Yeah, you have more comments than questions now. Do you want me to summarize those, or do you want to just?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, well, we've had a comment, and I do test things like this so I understand it, where you have like a really complex learning management system. So somewhere in whatever this group comes up with this summary, we need to have it clearly defined, what was tested, kind of thing. And then also there are things kind of with that comment, there are things that users can make inaccessible as they go along, which, so it of course wouldn't apply to that. But a lot of people think it really is resonating and supporting the effort, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And would this be a third party? Here's a question: a third party certification, or, we come up with the methodology, then who implements the methodology?
Yeah, I think that anybody that has a test process can get validated and say that they are validated or certified or something like that. And that's kind of what I envisage. much the same way as, you know, in other testing circumstances, you know, in other standardization circumstances, you've got to be qualified in order to validate a test process. You know, be it for, you know, whatever type of electronic product, or, you know, especially, see, one of the things is like around electronics product testing. You know, you used to be able to just plug your product into the wall, put a meter on there, and say, okay, well, it's within these tolerances of voltage and amps and all this sort of thing, and the thing is not melting, so good, right? This passes. And then in the early days of accessibility and usability, people started saying these things, you know, 20 years ago, and they said, you know, could we have something like that? And it's like, it's really hard to come up with standardized measures for usability, right? Because, you know, how many users is enough? What are the types of users? You know, the measures are just not the same. And, you know, there's been a whole manner of efforts in both of these communities. And the reason why this is a good time to be doing this now is because of the ACT, because that exists, and because there's a groundswell of interest now in making valid test processes. You know, the lawyers will. You know, we held a legal summit earlier this year, and one of the things that was discussed is that there is no standardization of measurement on which to build your case, right? So because there is an absence of a standard, you just have to argue back and forth, right? And bring in experts and that type of thing. So I think that having something like this, you know, would be of great interest to a lot of people, and certifying would be of great interest. And cool. Yeah, that sort of thing. So there's a long-winded answer of that question. Any others?
Yeah, there's quite a few others. Do you want to keep going, or do you want to wait for the Q&A later?
Let's take one more, and then we'll.
Okay. There have been several related questions about how do you take something that's not binary, and that's also kind of really individualized, based on, you know, every unique person with a disability, every unique person is different, and how do you make it kind of a pass-fail kind of answer?
Yeah.
And then sort of in with that is, you mentioned, but maybe you could stress again, that this isn't just based on WCAG A and AA. Some people are noticing in your example, you didn't you know, pull out A and AA separately, but I think you kind of addressed that. But just sort of that whole concept.
Sure. Yeah. In terms of the one of the big problems with accessibility, and you say to people, like, you're going to come up with one figure for accessibility, and it's like, well, what do you mean? Blind, low vision, deaf, hard of hearing, physical disabilities, cognitive disabilities? You know, it's not one. It's not binary. And one of the you know, one of the thoughts I had was of people sitting in meetings about crash test ratings and saying to themselves, no, the rollover crash test is the most important test. That's the one that everything has to be based off of. And somebody pipes up and says, no, the front impact crash test has to be the most important one. No, the side impact one. And it's like, how do we come up with a figure based off of all of these things? So when you try to combine, you know, one of the suggestions that we had out of the last meeting was that, you know, our gold star should only be based off of functional performance criteria. You know, is it usable without vision, usable without hearing, that type of thing. And that's a good suggestion to explore. But it does lend itself to these arguments where you come up with, you know, cases where, you know, a product is usable without hearing but not usable without vision, and how does that affect the star rating? And the short answer that I have right now is, well, you know, if you're limited to 5 choices of ratings, you're going to have to figure out some way of doing it, and somebody's not going to be happy. Okay, but that's why you need all the disability community groups on board with this, and that's why I've been having those kinds of these kinds of discussions with all the major disability groups. So those have all been happening offline, and we need to get them all on board, and we need to do those types of things and come up with votes. I think initially, one of the things that we might do is to focus just on the technical requirements of WCAG for the websites. Just because they do result in binary answers. They result in, you know, does your test process pass this or fail it? You know, does your product pass this or fail it based off of that validated test process? So yeah, good questions. And but one of the good things about creating a new standards group is you get to decide your own set of rules. Okay, and that leads us nicely into our plan and proposal. Here, next section, and if I didn't get to your question, we'll circle back to it at the end. And if we don't get to everybody's questions, we'll be saving them and we'll be addressing those questions in a write-up that comes after as well. Okay. So the final section here is about our plan and proposal. This is an image from the movie Office Space. If people have seen this, it's about the pleasures and perils of working in an office. But keen-eyed viewers of the movie would have seen during the interaction where someone's having an interaction about whether they're going to get fired or not. But in the background, they're just using this conference room. In the background, on the whiteboard, it says "Planning to Plan." And it's the sort of thing that's sort of a head slapper of a thing in business. But I came across this image as I was doing this because this whole initiative has really been planning to plan, and why things are still somewhat nebulous, that we haven't just come up with, here's a solution, here's an organization, join it or don't join it. I think that things in the accessibility field have started like that in the past and failed. So what we've instead tried to do is to take some time, and one of the luxuries I've had is to develop this as a proposal, is to give myself the time to have discussions and planning, and that we've had 2 meetings already, these face-to-face meetings where we're building this up, recognizing that most people don't actually have the time to pause and start thinking about this at a bigger level. So I'm sure many of you, like I used to work in the federal government as a contractor, and I kept doing test after test after test after test. And it's hard to step back out of that and have the time to think about the bigger picture. And think about, well, you know, why are we doing the testing? Why are we doing the testing? Shouldn't it be the vendors who are testing? Well, the vendors don't have any standards. So therefore we have our own standards, therefore we will test everything ourselves. You know, that was the logic. And so you ended up having to pay, you know, hundreds of people within the federal government to test things that the vendors really should have been testing. You know, it'd be like getting a department within the government to test, you know, electrical compliance. Well, they don't have to, because the vendors do that because they're standardized tests already, okay? In talking to some people, you know, they've said that, you know, this is, you know, this will never happen. So, you know, it's 50 years since the moonshot. You kind of missed that. You kind of missed that if you're looking at the news lately. You know, and people said back then, you know, at the beginning of the 60s, this will never happen. Yeah. Really, people just decided to go, right? And they decided this was the goal, and we're going to shoot for it, and we're going to go for it, and we're going to do it. Okay, and that's what caused it. And yeah, you could also say that people back then said that there wouldn't be any moon bases either. And lo and behold, there are no moon bases because we haven't actually gone back to the moon in 47 years. So yeah, things can get derailed. But if if the country had decided as a goal to create a moon base and stuck to it, it would have happened, but it didn't. So as a group, as a field, this is why these meetings are inclusive and open and getting the input of everybody before we actually start a formal process, is to take that time to get the feedback and to decide as a group what we want to do. Okay. I put a slide up here that says join the club, because it's kind of a club model, what we're talking about here. Join it and create a consensus standard, or don't. If you don't want to join it and you want to do, you want to create your test processes without regard to any consensus standards, fine, that's okay. Do your own thing. So I've got here an image of join the football club, yeah. And if you say to people, do you play football? It depends where you are standing on the planet as to what that typically means. So I've got a field that's an association football field. Then there's an American football field. Then there's a rugby football field. Then there's an Australian rules football field. And then there's a Gaelic rules, Irish Gaelic rules football. So, you know, people tend to join clubs, and those clubs have benefits and rules. Okay, so if you can see lines in history where things diverged. You know, association rules football came first. American football came later. It's still called football. Still involves a ball, but they have very different rules, and it's because a group of people said, "Well, we don't want to play that game. We want to play a new game." So we're not going to show up every Sunday and play association football. We're going to play American football. Okay, and you decide on a set of rules, you decide on a set of benefits, and that's your club. And if you operate outside those rules, yeah, if you had one team that said, yeah, we're gonna play, but we're only gonna play with 20 players on the field, right? And you say, no, actually it's 11. You need 11 players on the field. That's the rule. No, we're gonna have 20. Well, then you say, look, you're not playing by the rules. You can't be a member anymore. Okay. So all we're doing here is talking about, could we create a club that people could optionally join or not join? You know, in this area, you know, you've got federal government initiatives. Section 508 came out of the federal government. The federal government decides to set the rules, and everyone has to play along. If they want to sell to the federal government, they don't have to. They don't have to sell to the federal government. It's just an option. If you don't want to, then you don't have to play by those rules. If you do, then you need to play by the rules. Okay. There's other standards, as we mentioned, European Union and things like this. You know, choosing to follow WCAG requirements. That's a set of rules. You're opting in. So this is really no different. This is, you know, we need to think for ourselves as we get the choice to do what it is that we want to do as a group. Now, in order to do that, we need some sort of membership. And so what I've got here is just a few slides talking about what we would want to achieve as a group and trying to figure that sort of thing out. Now, these things are not set in stone. These things are still nebulous, but within 6 weeks or 7 weeks, I hope, we will come up with an actual formal plan. This is working towards an actual formal plan to start this actual work. Okay. So the goal state that I am suggesting here is that 1 year from now, or 1 year from when we actually start the formal work of this, that we would come to some sort of consensus, and that the 2 years from now, we would continue on with some sort of refinement. We could have 3, 4, 5-year goals, but I think that it's a bit too premature to do that before we actually have the formal group in place to begin with. But these are just suggestions. So for the web, I would suggest that 1 year from now, we should have a standardized reporting format, and that we should have figured out how to validate test methods that generate those standard reports. This is based off of the needs that we talked about before. For consumer products, I think that we should have a test methodology that can be used to evaluate products. One doesn't exist right now. And that we have some sort of initial posting of those results done by some groups. Okay. In 2 years, we could then refine that as for the web, this standardized reporting gets implemented in the field. That then we have a standardized validation method for the test methods and for training on those test methods. And that we would go beyond just web and start thinking about all sorts of digital content, you know, documents, mobile, wearables, that type of thing. And then for consumer products, we would want some sort of standardized reporting format and wider implementation. So if those are the goals, what sort of products would fulfill those goals? So this is just sort of working backwards from that. For the standards reporting format, you would have published implementable standards that have been voted on by the group. They've been voted on in terms of their format, their content, how the rating scales work, what sort of required information is needed, that type of thing. And then for the validation of the test methods, again, this is on the website, you would need a team of validators, you would need some methods, and you would need some resources, test cases, okay? The ACT would be finalized. Right now it's not finalized, okay, but they are working towards finalizing it later this year. So if those are your products that you would have, well, what do you got to do to develop those, okay? You would need a lead developer of your methods and resources. You would need input from and consultation with your members. One of the methodologies that I would propose is that you would have a paid developer rather than a design by committee situation. You know, when you start any initiative like this, and you know, if everybody is there voluntarily, and people sit down in a room or in a virtual room and they sort of look around the room, and somebody says, well, who's going to write the first draft? And then everybody sort of looks into their lap and you know, starts browsing their phones, and they're all thinking to themselves, well, I don't have time. I'd like to see my kids this summer. So instead, what you would do is you would hire somebody to do this, to develop these things. And that would need to be paid for. But get that recruited by the group and specified by the group, rather than have this sort of, it'll take 5 years to do because nobody's got any time, nobody's paid to actually do it. So that's the sort of methodology that I would propose. Okay. So yeah, so the development and prototyping, doing user studies, those types of things. So you would need somebody to do those types of things. So the tasks that you would have in the first year would be to develop the test process on the consumer product side, develop the standardized reporting format on the website, and the validation. And you would need some way of managing. There'd be a task point, which would be to manage the whole process and manage all the people that were involved and that sort of thing. Okay, so those are the things that would be required. Now, in order for anyone to have a hope of doing any of those tasks and achieving those products and meeting those goals, you would need members. So members is the first part, and that's why we've had these discussions. The first thing that we needed to do was to generate interest in the field. This started off, like I said, as a what if, and you know, it was just dinner discussions amongst us, a few colleagues of mine. We had that small invite meeting in November where we had 12 representatives from 12 different accessibility consulting and related groups, and where we talked about what if. And after further discussions, we had this face-to-face meeting in last month, where we discussed this with a wider group to gauge the interest in this. And based off of that meeting, there was a lot of interest, and hence we have this meeting today, this online meeting today, to generate interest. And so, well, what's the next step? The next step is now to have formal invitations to join a group by the end of July. So that is going to happen now. That's what's going to come out of this series of meetings. So the things that would I think I just skipped over one thing. Okay, no, I did not. Sorry. The things that sorry for jumping around there. The things that would need to still be worked out would be things like, for members, they'd have to figure out, well, how's this going to work? Is it a consortium? Is it an association? Is it a group? What is the structure of the organization? What are the benefits? What are the rules for membership? How much will this cost, and who's going to pay for it? Who's going to lead the development? That type of thing. Okay, so there's various types of memberships that you could think of around this. Okay. Don't try to read this chart. This is just a schematic or organizational chart. But all you need to know is that a small number of people that have been talking about this, we've been actually trying to figure out how would you actually run this, and how would an organization actually work. So you're trying to sort of sketch it out in terms of feasibility of what an organizational structure would be, who would be involved, who would be responsible for doing various aspects in order to figure this out. So a lot of that groundwork has happened. That's not what this meeting is about today. But a lot of the thinking of this for proposals has already been done. So when we do first start to meet here as an actual group, we would have something in order to bounce ideas off of already. There'd be some proposals that are already in place. So to have those things in place, what we want to do is to have a proposal document and a archived caption recording of this particular meeting today, and a formal invitation to join the group as part of a planning group. Yeah. So throughout August, what I would like to see, maybe weekly planning sessions of people that are interested to join and would like to see this come to fruition and be part of the actual development and part of the actual group. So that's what I'm planning to do by mid-July, I'm saying, which is really the end of next week. I would like to be putting out those things, and I will be sending these things out to the mailing list that we have. And then throughout August, these online meetings to decide how the organization will actually work, who will be involved, and make formal plans for going ahead. One of the key things that we'll have to do is to estimate our costs and figure out how that's going to be paid for. You know, some people have talked about crowdfunding as a way to do this. I can see where they're coming from. Going to external funding sources in the accessibility field. We're all used to putting our hands up and saying, look, we don't have any money. We don't have money to burn in this field, so we can't afford to be members. So we do have to think about that. The more members we have, maybe the sharing the load across more organizations, we could maybe achieve this with that kind of approach. So, but we're going to have to figure it out. Yeah. when they went to the moon, they had to figure out how this is going to be paid for, right? Okay, so in the background there, I mean, so the people that I have reached, yeah, the people that I have reached out to individually are on my list. The people that have received these invitations and joined these meetings are already notified of these things. And again, it's up to people whether they want to join or not. But there are still a number of key stakeholders that are probably unaware of this. Now, one of them, one of the list of key stakeholders is people like Consumer Reports, right? And I have to say, we have reached out to them previously. We've not gotten a response through regular channels, so we will continue to push that and try to use our connections. There's other organizations, there's a number of disability organizations that are already given me a verbal affirmative that they want to join in with us, and there's some that are still to be contacted and reached out to. So those types of things will also be happening at the same time. Okay. So that's what our immediate next steps are. It's like a 7-week or so plan, with the idea that at the end of September, at the end of August, the beginning of September, that maybe we could actually have a formal start date for this. Whether we form a new nonprofit group to manage this, or it's part of another group. I doubt that, but it could happen. So it would depend really on the outcomes of those discussions that would take place from the people who decide that they want to be members of this group. This is something that a number of us in the accessibility field have talked about for a number of years as an ongoing problem. People have grumbled over many hours, over many lunches and dinners, about the inadequacies of things like the VPAT and other reporting methods. People have grumbled about the fact that if you look up a regular manufacturer's washing machine website and you look for is it accessible, you will see ADA reach for front and side reach, and that's it. That's something to grumble about. That's not good enough, in my opinion, and the opinion of many of my peers who have said the same thing. So that's why this all came about. I really do thank you for taking part, and we're now going to move into sort of an open Q&A here. So I've said my piece. I'm happy to take questions. We've got about 17 minutes or so. So I'm going to hand it back to you, Laura. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I'll summarize a few of the questions that have been typed into the group chat. And again, these will be printed, and Chris's or a group of us will be getting back to you about these questions, maybe more specifically. There are some specific sort of concerns and asks about sort of some detailed testing questions. And, sometimes we know that some things are tested sort of specifically without taking into consideration like they'll test something that they know passes, but then ignore a bunch of stuff that doesn't pass. And could you just address sort of the integrity of this process and this group that or organization you're trying to form? I think that there's two parts to this question. One is
Sure.
Just the integrity of that. And then also, and that's my words, not anyone else's. But, yeah. And then also, how do you get it to 1 star when, there's so many different disability groups and difficulty using certain applications and stuff?
Yeah. So that latter one, I'll just say that, refer back to what I said at the end of the last session, is that Yeah, there'll be arguments. I mean, I think over other types of ratings, similar types of ratings, there have been lots of arguments, but that hasn't stopped people from saying that you still need to have some kind of report that is easy for people to use, and so so I'll leave it at that for now, and I think that we will definitely be addressing that type of thing in our discussions as a group. As we try to figure out what to do. Regarding sort of detailed technical questions and the complexity of testing for accessibility is probably not lost on anybody on this call, right? If you've been in any way involved in accessibility testing, that's why we hold the testing symposium, and that's why we people gather to discuss the many layers of complexity. And well, let's look at the alternative right now. Okay, the alternative right now is that you just have to trust a vendor says that it's accessible, right? And if you don't trust them, your choices are to take the product and test it yourself. The metaphor of crashing your own Ferrari into the brick wall to see whether it's safe enough for you to drive. That's an expensive proposition, you having to test that for yourself. Or if you have a vendor that says, look, our product creates accessible code, and you can tell that if you run it through any validated test process that it does not generate accessible code, then you've got something to hang that on and say, look, these test cases you are not passing, right? And this is our standard. So having an agreed upon standard enables you to go back and point to that and say, this is what people agree upon. Right, and in any industry consensus standard is not like a universal standard. So we're not talking about creating an ANSI standard or a ISO standard, right? But neither was WCAG an ISO standard, but it became one, right? Because eventually they said, look, this is good enough for us. This is what we want. Some people would have argued that things that were considered as AAA should have been AA, or that things that were A could have been AA, right? It took 10 years for them to come up with that, right? So all of those things have happened in the past, and we need to build on the fact that those things have happened in the past. We need to say, this is the standards of the requirements. Now let's come up with the standards for testing. Yeah. So yeah, I take the point that it is a complex area, but that doesn't mean that the goal should change, right? And the goal really should be to change the world, and this is, I think, a better path to actually changing the behaviors of people. Yeah.
Chris, there are a couple questions about if they're on this call, are they already on your mailing list to get more information? And then how can people be added to your mailing list?
Yes, yes. If you're on this call, you've got the RSVP, unless somebody inadvertently shared it with you and you didn't RSVP and you somehow got the login details. If you're one of those folks, you just have to email me. So email me, and I will put you on the mailing list, and then you'll get notifications for for when all those things that I talked about. When this recording goes up and when the formal invite goes out, you will be invited. So if you're on this call, you are not considered part of the organization yet. You're just on this call because you're interested. When we form an organization, initially, it will be open and anybody can join. And then once we figure out what the formal rules are, then we'll have to start thinking about membership in a more serious manner. Yeah.
Okay, and then would you like Chris now to just start taking hands up questions?
Sure.
Then I'll go on mute. You can just take over.
Okay. Do we have any hands up?
Yeah, does anyone, you could go off mute, people, if you guys want to ask away, I think. Is that fine, Chris?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I have unmuted myself so I can speak to you.
Hi.
Hi, this is Pina. This question you sort of touched on a little bit, Chris, and I know we've talked about it in our previous meeting, but I just wondered if you can sort of re-gauge a little bit. So when we talk about testing and the people who would be certified to test, that's all great. But if we are doing this for the consumers, and you mentioned before that you've reached out to the consumer groups, but they haven't responded, how do you foresee including consumers' feedback into this process? You know, and I'm thinking of, you know, the likes of what we currently see for the Yelp, through the Yelps and through, you know, other satisfaction, customer or consumer satisfaction programs. Thank you.
Well, sure. One of the ways that I've envisaged this as, you know, my background is usability before it was accessibility, and one of the things that I worked on a long time ago was to try to figure out how would you give a test process to people that don't know much about accessibility that covers accessibility issues. So you think of like the classic ones of like blindfold and low vision glasses and earplugs and things like this. And so what I would envisage for getting actual consumer feedback is that, you know, a group like Consumer Products, Consumer Reports, their methodology is they buy a product, they test the product, and then they report on it, and they own the product, and they can say whatever they want about the product, and they don't have any interaction with the manufacturers. But their team is made up of people that don't have disabilities, right? And they don't test that way now. So I think what you could do is you could give them initially things like screening tests where they screen out the issues. Like they would say, well, does this device talk? Okay, well, if no, then it gets a red mark about use without vision, and if it does talk, then they'll say, well, okay, well, how usable is this by somebody without vision? And that's a question that I don't think they're going to be able to answer themselves. And for them, then they're going to have to get consumer feedback. I think maybe what they could do is they could work with disability organizations to have products sent to them and tested by real people with disabilities, to use a not quite PC phrase, but that you know what I mean. But then use that as a feedback for consumer feedback, and you know, hopefully what this would then end up doing is to create a environment where usability and consumer input was a norm, talking about accessibility, right? So if you think of say going to Amazon and looking at consumer questions and consumer reviews, right? There's no way to filter those on accessibility right now. So and people don't tend to review products there now anyway, because you know, manufacturers don't generally make accessible consumer products, right? So it's kind of chicken and egg. I think that if you opened this up and you started this as a reporting, even if you're saying that things are not accessible, that would then open the doors to wider consumer feedback as well. So this thing, probably not the be all and end all, but it's probably the starting point, I would think, or I'd hope.
Just to follow up on that very quickly, and I think it's really important that, you know, especially if we call it a consumer industry kind of perspective, we want to make sure that the actual consumers engaged, and I think that's going to be key, right? Unless we think of it and call it something else.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Sure.
Right. But at the end of the day, I think, and then this is just my opinion as a consumer, not as an accessibility professional, I mean, at the end of the day, what you want is you want to be able to pick up a product and you want to be able to make sure that it meets your needs, your particular needs. And I think that if we can scale the rating of the accessibility functionalities or use or whatever we want to call it, to a simplified way of saying, yes, this is, within 3 seconds, I know I can take this product off the shelf or online and bring it home and it will work. I think that would be in the best track, because right now, even for digital web, we hear over and over and over again about organizations that are following the WCAG standards, that are using automated and manual testing, and they're still receiving complaints that stuff is not accessible or usable by persons with disabilities. So we've got to really shift it on its head and look at it from a consumer perspective.
Yeah, that's something that you're echoing what a lot of people have been saying. So yeah, totally agree. Any other questions from the group? We've got time for 2 quick ones. Just feel free to unmute yourself at this stage. Or Laura, would you like to go back to some of the questions that have already been written?
Yeah, one question that I see kind of over and over that I thought maybe would be worthy of a clarification from you is, you're not saying that anybody can just turn in their testing. You're saying, correct, that there would be a verification process of who could test for the gold star so that the testing could be trusted. I mean, right?
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, that, I think that's going to be a question that we're going to have to ask. Let me go back to the same analogy I've been using in the past, right? Okay. I as a private citizen could go crash a car into a wall and give it a star rating and post that on a website. Okay. If I did that, I'm sure the insurance companies probably wouldn't trust my results. Okay. But in the accessibility field, I mean, that's what we're all doing anyway right now, right? We're all testing things and posting results. You put it in front of 10 different testers, they can test 10 different ways and they give you 10 different reports, and there it is. So I think that what you need is some sort of structure and some sort of legal standing where you can say, yes, this test report has been validated. So I would envisage some sort of situation where, if I go back to what we had for, go back to the slide that had our test report. Let's go back here. At the very top of this, I've put in sort of some links to say, look, this was used by a certain test process and this is certified, and this was tested by a certain tester and that person is certified as a tester. And that you could follow those links and you could say, okay, is Jane Doe really a certified tester of this process? And is this test process actually in a list of approved test processes, that type of thing. So I would think that some of those structural things would need to be in place in order for it to work in practice. That you couldn't just have anybody saying, yeah, I tested it and I give it a gold star. It's like, well, what are your qualifications for giving it a gold star? It's like, well, I know accessibility. It's like, it's not what we need. We need a certification, something like that.
Right. So it's like there's a lot of built-in ability to do a deep dive. It's just that you want to have a simplified, quick look. Yeah, because I think that 99% of people making purchasing decisions are not going to do the deep dive, right? We had a comment that in the last meeting. We said some purchasing people think if it has a VPAT, it is accessible. That's all we need to check. Does it have a VPAT? And they don't even actually read the VPAT. They're just checking to see whether it has a VPAT. Well, that doesn't tell you anything, right? So that sort of thing is going on. Maybe time for Chris,
one more question.
Yeah. and we just had one that I was thinking about mentioning. He or she is asking about have we consulted with the trusted tester program process?
Sure.
And is that, and
yeah. They were involved. They were involved in the very first meeting. I used to be involved in the development in that, and so those folks have been involved. Yes, yeah. So a lot of the ideas come out of this, about the standardized reporting, because that's something that they they've standardized their reporting of their process within their system, but it's not generally widely available. Yeah. I know that we've reached 3:30. I want to thank everybody for joining today. Much appreciated for your valuable time being here. We will save the list of questions, and I will endeavor to make sure that those questions get answered to folks. I will send out next week, hopefully by the end of the week, I will send out the recording of the session, should you want to pass it on to your colleagues. And a lot of this is word of mouth, so if you think that you have colleagues that might be interested to join this type of initiative, feel free to pass that on and ask them to join the mailing list as well. I want to thank Laura for helping out with the questions. Much appreciated, Laura. And I will conclude that here. Thanks very much again.